Okay, this is my second part on question 2 in the Jordan Peterson, Matt Dillahunty conversation. And Dillahunty has basically said that religious deconversion is not a big deal morally. If you live without a God, then you're not going to go around raping and killing people. That's not a big deal. That's overblown. So give up the old man and you'll be happy like me. Now, the questioner isn't going to buy this fully.
I don't see much value in worrying about, oh, is it all going to go away, when it's clear it doesn't, because secular individuals are no more immoral or criminal-minded than anybody else. In fact, there may be some cases to show that we're less.
Now, if you want to hear my answer to a lot of that, go back to the first video. It was already been an hour long, so I wanted to render it so that I don't have to spend all day rendering stuff. And so I'm going to continue because I've got actually a lot I would still want to go through. Now, the questioner has a rebuttal here.
In this society, they are no more criminally minded. Like, we have a religious foundation, right? Like, I wouldn't go around like raping and pillaging if I abandoned God, but there were societies that did when they didn't have that structure.
Now, did you see Peterson nodding his head? Because originally the questioner wanted Peterson to answer this, so Peterson got cut off almost right away, and Dillahunty's been addressing it, and basically the questioner's on Peterson's side.
So how do you resolve that?
I'm not saying that religious authorities haven't been useful. It's just that what I hear from some people is that we should keep this because of that particular usefulness, because they fear what will happen otherwise, because what they've seen in the past. And I don't buy that, because that boils down to saying, I may not need religion, but you people do. And that is far too arrogant for me to ever adopt as a position.
Again, watch the previous video if you want me to engage. So I'm going to talk about, is this deconversion no big deal? But now he really gets into his second answer. So the first answer, if I go back through the slides, the first answer began with, I'm not trying to set up a system. I think the system's already set up. In other words, the question about getting rid of God is, hey, maybe the old man's been useful. This is an obsolete technology. Maybe the old man's been useful, but now we have arrived at a true, good, working, ethical system. We don't need God anymore to be good. In fact, God is getting in the way of being good. Get rid of God. Get God out of your life. And especially you people who want to get evolution out of textbooks and so on and so forth. Because again, if you go back and look at Richard Dawkins on Unbelievable, those are the bad people. And the other nice evangelicals who aren't really kvetching about evolution, yeah, we'll keep you around. You can believe what you want, just don't vote the wrong way, and don't try to have laws that are against abortion or things like this. And if you're nice, quiet Christians, we'll let you be. Not much to worry about it going away when it's clear it doesn't. Deconversion doesn't make a big deal. And again, in the last video, I talked about how the deconversion of my great-great-grandfather from Judaism to Christianity and their emigration from the Netherlands to the United States was tremendously consequential, not just in his life, but the life of his son, the life of his grandson, who was my grandfather, who was a Christian Reformed minister, the life of my father, who was a Christian Reformed minister, my life as a Christian Reformed minister. That deconversion, that changing horses, might not have changed old Hartog's life that much, but it sure sent his family on a new trajectory, because the family that he left behind in the Netherlands was all wiped out by the Holocaust. It changed everything. Well, what about on a societal level? Well, experiments in deconversion, and is there a social science evidence that religiosity impacts moral behavior? Now, actually, there's quite a bit, and this is a huge subject. In the last video, I brought up George Gallup's The Saints Among Us. There are many, many, many studies on the impact of religion in people's lives in many ways. And most of those studies will say things like, religious people are happier. Religious people are more generous to nonprofits, not just religious nonprofits, but other nonprofits. Now, I am not saying here, and again, watch the last video, I am not saying here that any given religious person is more moral than any given non-religious person. Because again, I have friends in my life who are outspoken atheists that I have trusted with my life and would trust with my life more than some Christians. In fact, some pastors I know, I wouldn't trust with anything. Because I have zero expectation of their moral character, because I have seen their moral failures and I don't want to have anything to do with them. And I'm not saying they're not Christians, but that's the whole other conversation, whether someone is a Christian by profession or by behavior. But I'm going to leave that alone. T.M. Lerman is a very interesting anthropologist. She decided to, people are often going off to find some tribe where they can do anthropology. She decided she wanted to do anthropology in a vineyard congregation. Now, the vineyard church, it's really hard if you're not familiar with Christianity to try to keep track of all these crazy subgroups. The vineyard movement grew out of the professor at Fuller Seminary named John Wimber, and it's kind of this merger between Calvinism and Pentecostalism. And there are vineyard churches all over the United States. Odds are someone out there watching this is a member of a vineyard church, and you will present yourself in the comment section. I know you will. But she decided to be an anthropologist and get into the vineyard church to do an anthropological study of this. And you can find the book that she wrote. It's a fascinating book. But in this piece in the New York Times, this is one of the things she begins with. One of the most striking scientific discoveries about religion in recent years is that going to church weekly, we're not even talking about religious faith, but people who go to church weekly, going to church weekly is good for you. Religious attendance, at least religiosity, boosts the immune system, decreases blood pressure. It may add as much as 2 or 3 years to your life. The reason for this is not entirely clear. And then she goes on from there. But if you do the research, you will find that religiosity and religion has generally been good for humanity. And yeah, there's also been some bad stuff. I'm not gonna say no to that. I've got my own list, but this is pretty much settled knowledge. And there are a lot of little reasons for it. A social structure, consolation. There's all kinds of ways in which religion helps people. Now, Sam Harris and a lot of the celebrity atheists will say those are obsolete technologies. We can do better with current technologies. If you go to a secular therapist, you'll do better than going to a pastor, so on and so forth. Most therapists I know have a certain degree of respect, if not a respect for the positive aspects that religion and people who practice religion can get in their lives. And I think many people believe this. This is part of the reason why even parents who don't go to church, at least until about 20 years ago, and still in some places, mostly red states, will continue to send their children to church for some level of religious instruction because they believe it is helpful morally. What's happened kind of in the blue and red states is that the red states have kind of continued to side with the church and the blue states have kind of continued to move away from it. And I had a conversation earlier today with someone who was practicing Buddhism, and that's part of the conversation that he wanted to have with me. I may not need religion, but people do. Now, Dillahunty wants to show himself more not as an elitist. That he's not going to say that. Now, this, in a sense, makes him a Protestant atheist. And why I say that is because, as I talked about in my video earlier today with the Buddhists, that one way to look at religions, especially looking at, say, the difference between Roman Catholicism, Orthodoxy versus Protestant religions, is kind of this idea of one speed, two speed. Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christians tend to be two-speed. In the tradition, there's kind of regular Christians who are working secular jobs, and then there are super Christians who are in the monastery practicing, and they might be the clergy, something like that. Protestants, I'm not wearing a collar. Protestants tend to be one-speed religion. The goal of John Calvin in Geneva was to make Geneva a Christian city, not to have the city of man and the city of God. It's to make the whole thing the city of God. And this gets into a very big theological conversation, but there's this kind of idea that, well, some people need religion. Jesse Ventura says this. Some people need religion because they need a crutch. Dillahunty wants to be a man of the people. He's a Texan. He's an egalitarian American. I'm not going to be condescending to say I may not need religion because I have reason and smarts and education and I'm an authority, but you might need religion because you're not thinking about much, and you might need to clutch to your guns and religiosity, as a former president very famously said, which was really stupid for him to say. Dillahunty says that's too arrogant for him to ever adopt such a position. But doesn't that become the central question of the naturalism, materialism, when it comes to the question of authority? Now, I began the last video. I'm hoping you saw the last video first and I'm watching this. I would have put it into one, but it's just a little bit easier to render them one and then the other when they get long. What about authority? What about authority? And so in a sense, Dillahunty is saying this is a one-speed deal. We can all live without God. So he's in a sense a Protestant atheist. We can all live without God. Now, what's interesting to me is, again, I've referred to this article a number of times called The Heretic. It was in the Weekly Standard. I'll put the link down in the notes. And because Thomas Nagel comes around, and again, if you're interested in this stuff and you can read philosophy, if you've not read Mind and Cosmos, you might want to read it. He's a naturalist, materialist who is very critical of their project and says it doesn't really work and we should give it up. And the story is told of this group of, including Daniel Dennett and Richard, I think Richard Dawkins was there too. I don't know if Sam Harris was there, but they're having this meeting, and Thomas Nagel is he who must not be named. Daniel Dennett took the view. Now, I've mentioned in my video that I posted yesterday or the day before, Don Hoffman. You might mention Don Hoffman noted Daniel Dennett a number of times. Daniel Dennett took a different view. While it is true that materialism tells us a human being is nothing more than a moist robot, a phrase Dennett took from a Dilbert comic, Scott Adams, who I've also made videos about, we run the risk when we let this cat out of the bag, or robot out of the bag. If we repeatedly tell folks that their sense of free will or belief in objective morality is essentially an illusion, such knowledge has a potential to undermine civilization itself, Dennett believes. Does Dillahunty believe this? This is a really interesting question. I'd like to know. So if you know whether Matt Dillahunty has answered this question, put it in the comment section, because I'm curious. Because Dennett is what Dillahunty says he isn't. Dennett says, no, I don't know that we should let everybody think this, because society runs better if we all imagine we have free will, and so civil order requires the general acceptance of personal responsibility, which is closely linked to the notion of free will. Better, said Dennett, if the public were told for general purposes the self and the free will and the objective morality do exist, that colors and sounds exist too. Now we're getting into Don Hoffman territory. Not just in the way they think. Oh, okay. They exist in a special way. Okay. And I think that's kind of what Don Hoffman says, which is to say ultimately not at all. Oh. On this point, the discussion grew testy at times. Now we're seeing a division among the atheists. So Dillahunty here, when he makes the mention that he's a one-speed atheist, not a two-speed atheist, he's declaring which internal side he is of this atheist division. On this point, the discussion grew testy at times. I was reminded of the debate among British censors over the publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover a half-century ago. Fine for you or me, one prosecutor said to have remarked, but this is the sort of thing you would leave what, but is this the sort of thing you would leave lying around for the wife or servant to read? That would be two-speed. Materialism, then, is fine as far as it goes. It just doesn't go as far as materialists want it to. And this is where exactly we get into morality. It is a premise of science, not a finding. And this is where Peterson keeps pushing Dillahunty. Scientists do their work by assuming that every phenomenon can be reduced to a material, mechanistic cause, and by excluding any possible non-material explanation. That's natural, supernatural. And the materialist assumption works really, really well in detecting and quantifying things that have a material or mechanical explanation. This is where Peterson says these are powerful tools. Okay? Peterson, tool-oriented. Materialism has allowed us to predict and control what happens in nature with astonishing success. This is the ongoing war between nature and reason, what we've talked about with C.S. Lewis's miracles. The jaw-dropping edifice of modern science, from space probes to nanosurgery, is the result. Look at what we've done. It's amazing. But the success has gone to the materialists' heads, says Thomas Nagel. From a fruitful method, materialism becomes an axiom. Notice how often this comes up in this conversation. Materialism itself has become an axiom, not the conclusion of science. If science can't quantify something, it doesn't exist. And so the subjective, unquantifiable, immaterial, manifest image, this world that we innocently, naively embrace as we watch it, of our mental life, is proven to be an illusion. And this is, in a sense, where Daniel Dennett and Don Hoffman are in agreement. The world as we see it is an illusion. You know, I played a lot of Don Hoffman stuff, and a number of you are like, wow, this is incredible. And that's how I felt when I thought, wow, this is incredible. The more I thought about it, I realized this isn't incredible. This is what we've been talking about all along. He's just starting from a different starting point. Here, materialism bumps up against Nagel. Nagel insists that we know some things to exist, even if materialism omits or ignores or oblivious to them. Reductive materialism doesn't account for the brute facts of existence. Natural laws, for one thing. Laws of physics, for another. It doesn't explain, for example, why the world exists at all, or how life arose from non-life, the hard problem of consciousness. Close to home, it doesn't plausibly explain the fundamental beliefs we rely on as we go about our everyday business. This is Peterson's point. The truth of our subjective experience, our ability to reason, our capacity to recognize that some facts are virtuous, some acts are virtuous, and others aren't. How do we know what is virtue? Dillahunty basically says, we've arrived, we're already teaching it to our kids, no worry to pull the God chip out now, we'll all be fine. We don't need him anymore. Brute facts are irreducible, and materialism, which operates by breaking things down to their physical components, stands useless before them. There is little or no possibility, he writes, that's Nagel, that these facts depend on nothing but the laws of physics. That's Thomas Nagel. If Dillahunty wants to debate someone, he should probably ask Thomas Nagel if he's willing. You can sympathize with Leader and Weisberg for fudging on materialism, or Dillahunty. As a philosophy of everything, it is undeniably a drag. As a way of life, it is even worse. Fortunately, now again, Dillahunty says it's no big deal. Thomas Nagel says you can't live it. That's what Jordan Peterson says too. Fortunately, materialism is never translated into life as it's lived. As colleagues and friends, husbands and mothers, wives and fathers, sons and daughters, materialists never put their money where their mouth is, which is exactly what Peterson keeps hitting Dillahunty with. Nobody thinks his daughter is just molecules in motion and nothing but. Nobody thinks the Holocaust was evil, but only in a relative provisional sense. A materialist who lives his life according to his professed convictions, understanding himself to have no moral agency at all, seeing his friends and enemies and families as genetically determined robots, wouldn't just be a materialist, he'd be a psychopath. Say what you will about Leiter and Weisberg and the workshoppers in the Berkshires. From what I can tell, none of them is a psychopath, not even close. This is Dillahunty's point. He deconverted from Southern Baptistism, no problem, and life is better now. And this is the deconversionist story. I used to be repressed by religion. Now I can drink alcohol. You can drink alcohol in the Reformed Church, by the way. I can drink alcohol. I can smoke weed. I can do psychedelics. If I want to divorce my wife, nobody's going to bat an eye. If I want to sleep with my secretary, well, I got to worry about HR and maybe the Me Too movement. But beyond that, it's okay. No church is going to discipline me. No church is going to kick me out, even if I kick myself out before they get a chance to kick me out. I'm free. Oh, all right. But your philosophy doesn't say you're free at all. In fact, your choice to deconvert, that's a subject of debate. And Dillahunty again said he's a compatibilist. Applied beyond its own usefulness as a scientific methodology, materialism is, as Nagel suggests, self-evidentially absurd. Mind and Cosmos can be read as an extended paraphrase of Orwell's famous insult. One has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe things like that. No ordinary man would be such a fool. Materialism can only be taken seriously as a philosophy through a heroic feat of cognitive dissonance, pretending in our abstract intellectual life that values like truth and goodness have no objective content even in our private life. So again, devil and Satan, they're the same. We try to learn what's really true and behave in a way we know to be good. Nagel has sealed his ostracism from the intelligentsia by idly speculating why his fellow intellectuals would undertake such a feat. Now, here's what's interesting. So again, I played some Donald Hoffman yesterday and got quite a response, which was not unsurprising to me. If you dig into what this guy has to say, he has to say a lot. Now, again, if you listen to a bunch of his stuff, he quotes from Dennett. He's not easily aligned along, again, as I think as a function of consciousness and our limited capacities, we always want to say good, bad. Well, let's up the resolution a bit. And Donald Hoffman and what he has to say is going to be more complicated. But one of the things that he says, which as a lot of people have been saying, is that Darwin does not tell us we know truth by natural selection. Natural selection basically susses out fitness. And this actually is what Alvin Plantinga has been saying.
Who wins? Well, I hate to break it to you, but perception of reality goes extinct. In almost every simulation, organisms that see none of reality but are just tuned to fitness drive to extinction all the organisms that perceive reality as it is.
Now apply this to morality. What this says is that this imagined brave new world where now the human being, released from the shackles of oppressive religion, applies only reason. If reason is a function of nature, where does that leave us? Or do you say reason is separate from nature? Reason enables us to transcend nature. Reason enables us to colonize nature. Again, those of you who have been following along with C.S. Lewis and Miracles, this is where we're going with Miracles. I haven't forgotten my project. A lot of these other things have come up, but it's all along the same lines of morality, naturalism, and ethics. Well, what's he saying? Reality, some reality, nature selects only fitness.
So the bottom line is evolution does not favor vertical or accurate perceptions. Those perceptions of reality go extinct. Now this is a bit stunning. How can it...
Now again, if you remember earlier in the conversation, Dillahunty says, I don't throw Sam Harris from the stage because my ancient forebears had these qualities and those have been passed on to me. If you say that, you're not saying there's any rightness about these qualities. You're only saying there's fitness about these qualities. So therefore, what my morality and ethics are is fitness. This is going to get us into a problem because, well, how do we know within what time span this fitness will work? We're knocking on the door of Peterson's definition of truth again, and we're going to get back to there.
Be that not seeing the world accurately gives us a survival advantage. That is a bit counterintuitive. But remember the jewel beetle. The jewel beetle survived for thousands, perhaps millions of years using simple tricks and hacks. What the equations of...
Now this jewel beetle thing, earlier in the, and again, if you watch the whole TED Talk, he'll make the point that, well, Aboriginals started drinking beer. They started leaving the beer bottles around. This jewel beetle's interface, what these beer bottles looked like to this jewel beetle was the sexiest, hottest female jewel beetle he could ever imagine. And the jewel beetles all over the desert were humping these beer bottles like crazy and were going extinct. And so they had to do something about the beer bottles. Otherwise, they'd lose all the jewel beetles. This is Hoffman's point. If you're a materialist, we're no different from the jewel beetle. We're a little more complicated, but functionally, stuff like this can take us out. Now, yesterday I was having a conversation with someone via Facebook, and he pointed me to a bunch of videos that talked about mating practices and, you know, how Tinder works and how OkCupid and what this is doing. And so then I watched this video, and basically he said, you know, all this stuff about feminism, none of this makes any difference. You want to know what's really changing us? The pill. Why? Because the pill is radically changing the way mating is happening. You know who I first heard make that point? Peterson.
Millions of years using simple tricks and hacks. What the equations of evolution are telling us is that all organisms, including us, are in the same boat as the jewel beetle. We do not see reality as it is. We're shaped with tricks and hacks that keep us alive.
So are we humping the beer bottle? We're evolving for fitness. It outcompetes evolving for truth. Nature doesn't need reason to keep us alive. We stay alive with tricks and hacks in the interface. Now we have to ask the question, what is reason? Is reason an illusion? Is reason natural? Where does it come from? What is the relationship between reason and morality? Let's get back to experiments in conversion and deconversion. Is there social science evidence that religiosity impacts moral behavior? Yeah, there's a lot. You can go out and find it. Are there social experiments that inform us about societies without religion? Because again, as I mentioned in the last video, the real question here isn't the question so much if Matt Dillahunty converts or deconverts. The question is, what are the impacts over generations on a global scale of religion? Now we're starting to see religion as very consequential. And it's difficult to know when you listen to the celebrity atheists which frame of reference they're talking about. Because on one hand, they want to say, you can deconvert and it's not a big deal. And I've seen a number of deconversions in my life, some of them very up close. And what amazes me so often is when people, for example, if they grew up in a very fundamentalist Christianity, they become fundamentalist atheists. And a lot of the things that they still stick to are these tricks and hacks that have worked for them in the past, and they just give them new de-religious reasons. Now we're back to The Rider and the Elephant with Jonathan Haidt. This stuff is really complicated. But the question is, what about for societies over multiple generations? Is Dillahunty right? This is where Dillahunty gets triggered. because Peterson, who was supposed to answer the question, now jumps in again. And we might just ask, is getting triggered nature or reason? Well, let's go back and let's watch what is probably the most interesting exchange of the evening, because Peterson jumps in and then Dillahunty pauses and then he goes.
Okay,
So
I don't want to take up too much time, but did you want to speak
I
to
have a
that?
quick comment on
And again, sorry for the volume being low.
riding around on the shoulders of giants, which was the central theme in Matt's answer. We ride around on the shoulder of giants, and the meta-giant is God. That's a very good way of thinking about it.
Except
we
that I
think
can
about
identify.
that as, we can think about that as, I don't care about the metaphysical implications of that. I don't have to care about that at the moment. But if you look at the evolution of the idea of God, for example, and I think this is particularly true with the evolution of the idea of Christ, is that we do ride around on the shoulders of giants, and the figure of Christ, psychologically speaking, is the giant among giants. It's a meta-giant, and it's a ritual model for emulation. And the ritual model is something like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it nobly, which is a metaphysical statement in some sense that lies at the bottom of the ethic even that Matt is presenting. And so it is deeply embedded in a religious substructure. And that's the metaphorical substructure that I was talking about that necessarily underlies these self-evident axiomatic rules.
Now, I got to confess that when I first heard him, who's this? It's Yanni or Lauren. I remember which it is. I heard the L. I heard Laurel first. I got it wrong in the previous video, and I want to totally own that. It's the metaphorical substructure, not the metaphysical substructure. That's why I was so blown away when I heard metaphysical, because I thought, did he just say metaphysical? Because only in the Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin conversation has he used the metaphysical word much, but the metaphorical substructure. And so here Peterson is saying, again, with all of his usual caveats, psychologically, again, there's Jung in here, psychologically, this is really important. And so whether or not there's a God in your system, and again, back to my previous video talking about Santa Claus, whether or not you believe that in the ontology of this God, the functionality of this God in your system is really important. He's built in from below, and this again is main criticism of the celebrity atheist. You can't just pluck him out at the end, you know, like some extra thing at the end of the manufacturing process. You don't know how this will impact everything because you can't run that experiment. Now, Peterson is about to say, we have run that experiment and it doesn't go well, and that's when Dillahunty is going to be triggered.
Which are not, by any means, as you point out, self-evident in the least. There's plenty of cultures that train their young men to be absolutely barbaric monsters, right? Warriors, kill.
What does Peterson care about? Watch his emotions right now. How do we know what people care about? Watch him. Dillahunty cares about this too. This is one of the most interesting moments of the evening.
Rapists, right? Bloodthirsty right to the core. Perfectly viable mode of being, arguably speaking, from the perspective of generating a set of axiomatic rules. Why is it not better to have 10,000 women than one? There's an evolutionary question for you. Well, reasonable people wouldn't do that. Oh yeah, right. Reasonable people. Yeah.
So, what is reason? Is reason always contextual? This is a real question. If you bring in Don Hoffman, he would say reason is part of the tricks and hacks that we use that sends this beetle humping beer bottles. Up. Peterson got triggered. He's into it now. Dillahunty, he's not going to sit for this. Look at his eyes. Watch the body language. He's trying to contain himself.
So if it's
Peterson could have been doing this.
not clear, I can I can point to the giants. I can't point to the mega giant. And
It's because it's an abstraction.
Sure, but when you hold Christ up as a
Sure, you're a materialist. Own your stuff.
particular figure, the only information that I have about Jesus comes from the Bible. And rather than going through all of it again, because there's lots of people with questions, if you go to ironchariots.org, you will find a verse-by-verse deconstruction of the Sermon on the Mount where I point out that Jesus gave some good advice and some crappy advice and some questionable advice, and that's not enough. And there's not a secular humanist organization or country on the planet that has ever produced as a good thing, an intentional good thing, rapists and murderers.
Okay, pause here, because he just said he's using evidence. There's not a secular humanist organization on the planet, organization or society on the planet that has produced this. So he's saying, we know my experiment because of, we can already find evidence out there about the secular humanist societies and organizations, and they're not producing murderers. Before we get into when he flips on this, which is almost right away, just do a Google search about women complaining about how they're treated at atheist conventions. I don't want to, I'm not trying to say you can do a Google search about how women are treated in church. There are plenty of complaints there too. But it isn't quite the brave new world that I hear, because at least in church, if there's at least a layer of understanding that, well, it's in the Bible. It's in the book of Timothy, where Paul says to Timothy, treat the older women in your church as if they're your mothers, and treat the younger women in the church as if they're your sisters. That's the rule. And if you break that rule, you're breaking a rule. There's at least a rule.
So,
Well, that's highly debatable. That's highly debatable.
actually,
one
it's
of the things
absolutely true, because there's never been a secular humanist government on the planet.
That was a fast flip. So first he says, look at them, and then he says, there's never been one. Now maybe he's going to say there's never been a government, but at least societies. So, and fair enough, because churches have played the same game, flip-flopping about, look at us. Look at the church. We're supposed to be the kingdom of heaven. Oh, look at the church. The pastor's sleeping with the organist. I think that's a people problem. And so really, if you want to take a look at the two things, look at the rules, look at the documents, which is exactly what Dillahunty is going to say now.
I don't know. I think the Soviets were pretty secular.
No,
humanists.
Then,
I know
with all due apologies, you do not know the first thing about what secular humanism is.
We're worked up now.
You should read the secular humanist manifestos, because what happened in Russia and communist countries was an institution of a religious-like structure centered around an individual and forced atheism, none of which is consistent with humanism. None of it. And we can talk about this later, and I'll be happy to point you to this, because you can say that it was an atheist thing that went awry, but you can't call it secular humanism. It's just not there. There's no humanism in what was done there. But
Interesting. So, well, what do you think about this? I had never heard before, because I actually haven't spent a lot of time with the celebrity atheist conversations at all. That's not really where I'm at. I don't follow this, because I look at this mostly as just a modernist fight between the modernist evangelists and the celebrity atheists, and back and forth they go pretty much just in modernism. But then I was talking to Carbon Mike, who has a podcast, and Carbon Mike in one of his podcasts mentioned Peter Hitchens. And I had heard about this before, but I hadn't paid much attention to it. Peter Hitchens is the brother of Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens. They were both raised as Christians in England with a religious education. They both deconverted. Peter became a socialist, and he gives a fair amount of biography in this book. And he was a journalist who lived for a time in the Soviet Union. And this came up specifically in his book, Rage Against God, and I thought it was interesting because I had never heard that a defense for this position was that Russia was a religion, because that just kind of flipped me around. And then when I heard this here too, I thought, oh, this is where this comes from. So let's play his response.
Are atheist states not actually atheist? The epigraph for this chapter is taken from the 94th Psalm. Take heed, ye unwise among the people. O ye fools, when will ye understand? Let us examine the strange problem of the atheist states, which a ruthlessly honest, godless person must surely admit as a difficulty. Intelligent Christians must, if they're candid, accept that faith has often led to cruel violence and intolerant persecution. They may say, as I would, that this was because humans often misunderstand or misuse the teachings of the religions they follow. This is not because they are religious, but because man is not great. Atheists, in return, ought equally to concede that godless regimes and movements have given birth to terrible persecutions and massacres. They do not do so, in my view, because in these cases the slaughter is not the result of a misunderstanding or excessive zeal. Utopia can only ever be approached across a sea of blood. This is a far greater problem for the atheist than it is for the Christian, because the atheist uses this argument to try to demonstrate that religion specifically makes things worse than they otherwise would be. On the contrary, it demonstrates that our ability to be savage to our own kind cannot be wholly prevented by religion. More important still, atheist states have a consistent tendency to commit mass murders in the name of the greater good. It is difficult to claim that Christianity has learned nothing from its past cruelty, or that such cruelty is written in its laws or prescribed by its beliefs. When did Christians last burn, strangle, or imprison each other for alleged errors of faith? By contrast, those who reject God's absolute authority, preferring their own, are far more ready to persecute than Christians have been, and have grown more inclined to do so over time.
Now, it's important here to recognize that Hitchens is saying, really what we're talking about is a question of authority, which I said at the beginning of the first one. And that's really what this question is. Who's the authority that determines what is ethical? And Christianity, at least in theory, tries to say that God is the authority. And atheism, at least in theory, tries to say that we are the authority. And then the question in a lot of these debates is, well, who do you trust more?
Each revolutionary generation reliably repeats the savagery. The Bolsheviks knew all about the French Revolutionary Terror, but that did not stop them having their own. The Chinese communists knew all about Stalin's intentional famine and 5-year plans, but they repeated the barbarity with a great leap forward. The Khmer Rouge were not ignorant of their revolutionary forerunners, yet they repeated the evil worse than before. The supposedly enlightened revolution of Fidel Castro resorted swiftly to torture and arbitrary imprisonment, and to the lawless purging and murder even of Castro's old comrades such as Huber Matos. By comparison, where now do we see Christian churches or factions persecuting each other as they did in the Reformation or Counter-Reformation? Nowhere. The delusion of revolutionary progress and the ruthlessness it justifies survives any amount of experience. This suggests that terror and slaughter are inherent in utopian materialist revolutionary movements. There will be another of these episodes along soon. What then do we gain by rejecting God and worshipping ourselves instead? But atheists cannot bear to look their faith's faults full in the face. They cannot even admit that their dogmatic insistence that there is no God is in fact a faith, although they cannot possibly know if they're right. Their belief, apparently, is not even a belief. And so the escape clauses come thick and fast. If atheism in practice appears at any point to have had bad consequences, that is because it took on the character of religion. So this murder, that massacre, that purge just do not count. If religious people do good things with good consequences, that is because they're really atheists without knowing it. We're told by my brother, for example, that Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union was in fact a religious state. In the mouth of any other person serving a cause other than the comfortable West's rejection of self-restraint and divine law, such thin, self-serving stuff would produce scorn and mockery from the anti-religion advocates. As I show in a later chapter, the specifically anti-religious and more specifically anti-Christian character of the Soviet system under Stalin makes such a claim nonsensical. To say that Stalin used many of the outward forms of religion is perfectly reasonable and true, but to claim that the outward forms are more important than the inward character is plainly false. It is precisely the inward character, submission to an earthly authority instead of an eternal authority, that makes all the difference. The humanist cult in Stalin's Russia and Kim Il-sung's North Korea. Stalin's system resembled religion in one important way. Stalin, who had been schooled in a seminary, wished to be worshipped, despite the fact that he was a man and not God. Kim Il-sung, brought up as a Protestant and an accomplished church organist, sought the same goal. Both men understood very well the power of religion over the human mind. Both deliberately chose not to use religion to sustain their regimes, as the Russian Tsars had sought to do. They chose a far more difficult course. They hated faith in God so much that they instead destroyed it and supplanted it with a humanist cult that vested all power in themselves, and that, unlike true religion, was bound to die. In North Korea, this did not involve as much destruction as in Russia, since Christianity was not so well established there, and ancient traditions rather than a deity tend to prevail. There is no war on these traditions as such, and especially not on ancestor worship, since it does not conflict with the regime, but marches merrily alongside it. By great good fortune, I've witnessed on a beautiful autumn morning what seemed to be the entire population of Pyongyang, streaming out of the city on bicycles and in buses for the ancient Korean harvest festival of Chuseok, which involves, among other things, eating rice cakes in the shape of the crescent moon and holding picnics amid the hilltop graves of your forefathers. No attempt was being made to suppress this survival, and in fact the people had worked the previous Sunday by government order so as to take the correct day off for the feast, a date governed by the moon rather than by the state. There was no menace in this prehistoric pagan rite to the authority of the dear and great leaders. Why not? Because even if millions of people took part in it, it did not challenge the authority of state, party, or leader. No alternative allegiance was required. By contrast, a single secret celebration of Christian Holy Communion, involving 3 or 4 people honestly pledging themselves to be ruled by a rival authority would, if discovered, have been suppressed with all the fury and venom the state could muster. Stalin and Kim made human idols of themselves because they believed, as utopian idealists always do, in the ultimate goodness of themselves and the unchallengeable rightness of their decisions. There was no higher power, and so there could be no higher law. If people disagreed with them, it was because those people were in some way defective, insane, malignant, or mercenary. The rulers could not tolerate actual religion because they could not tolerate any rival authority or any rival source or judge of goodness, rectitude, and justice. Modern revolutionists frequently make a point of openly and specifically rejecting the very idea of absolute, unalterable goodness outside time and space. Bela Kun, whose Hungarian Soviet Republic mimicked Lenin's Russian original, proclaimed that none of his acts were either moral or immoral. The only test of his state was whether it benefited the proletariat, and he was the judge of that. George Lukács, a commissar for culture and education in Bela Kun's mercifully brief government, is credibly said once to have advised a comrade, Ilona Duchinska, "Communist ethics make it the highest duty to accept the necessity of acting wickedly. This is the greatest sacrifice the revolution asks from us. The conviction of the true communist is that evil transforms itself into good through the dialectics of historical evolution." The same shifty Lukács continues to this day to attract admirers among radical intellectuals. It is important to grasp that the Marxist moral worldview has no lower limit, and that its most charming, civilized, and tasteful adherents all necessarily share the same lack of scruple. Jesuits, with no fear of hellfire. This sort of belief is not just the thinking of a small-town bully such as Stalin. The charming, witty, well-educated, and still admired Bolshevik Nikolai Bukharin, in his 1921 book, Theory of Historical Materialism, viewed ethics as useless, fetishistic survivals of old-class standards. He compared the proletariat to a carpenter. If the proletariat wishes to attain communism, then it must do such and such as does the carpenter in building a bench, and whatever is expedient from this point of view, this must be done. Ethics transforms itself for the proletariat, step by step, into simple and comprehensible rules of conduct necessary for communism, and in point of fact, ceases to be ethics. This very logic brought about Bukharin's torture and death. The same might be said of Leon Trotsky, who sneered in Their Morals and Ours in 1938. Whoever does not care to return to Moses, Christ, or Mohammed, whoever is not satisfied with eclectic hodgepodges, must acknowledge that morality is a product of social development, that there is nothing invariable about it, that it serves social interests, that these interests are contradictory, that morality, more than any other form of ideology, has a class character. Trotsky also, rightly, pointed out that Christians often manipulate their own precepts to suit themselves. But, in the way of Marxists, he could not see that this was a criticism of their humanity, not of their Christianity. If they'd stuck to their beliefs, they would have been unequivocally better than any Bolshevik. It was their failure to do so that rightly opened them to his derision. His old foe Stalin, employing the same moral code, thought it served the proletarian cause to have Trotsky murdered in 1940. Those familiar with Marxist squabbles will know that there is no final court of appeal on such matters. History, written by the victors, is said to be the judge. And this means that those who win are also right, which is and must be the core of all ad hoc, human-based moral codes.
Those who win must be right, and that's the core of ad hoc moral codes. And this is, in effect, part of the problem, that the question of authority says, who finally gets to judge? Well, in a sense, we say, well, we've arrived. Religion is obsolete, and we know now, we know what is right and wrong, so God can be disposed of, and we will simply stick to now. If you go back and you listen to Dillahunty in this very same lecture, he will have proudly stated that part of the advantage of his system is that, unlike religion, it can be updated. Well, upon what rules will you update your morality? That's a tricky thing. The problem of authority. Children cannot be expected to construct an entire moral system in time. This is a multi-generational process. The contents of these systems are consequential, and their consequences magnify as generations continue. But we are back to the problem of you can't write a fairy tale, because again, part of Peterson's argument is, hey, look, these stories are the accumulation of thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of wisdom, and they have given to us this. This is a foundation. Now, you can't get to this place and just say, okay, we're going to get rid of what's below. We don't need that anymore. We'll just keep building up. Peterson says no. The problem of authority is that naturalist systems must leave a humanist system or a specific human being as the highest authority. If you entrust it to a system, how flexible will that system be to revive itself? And so, again, Peterson, back to his biblical lectures, talks about the fact that in Christianity, you have the king, and the king is top of the dominance or maybe the competence hierarchy. But that king is a human being. What is to keep that king from being corrupted? That king has to be held to a standard. Well, what is that standard? Well, there must be something above the king. There must be something that the king is answerable to. In the Old Testament prophets, the prophet comes and says to the king, you must keep the covenant. You must keep the law. And right there you can see this development. Now, how will this stuff continue to be edited and updated in a way that continues to ensure the ancient wisdom of the predecessors? Now, Dillahunty, in all fairness, says there's a lot of ancient wisdom there. What authority decides which is wise and which isn't? And now what we tend to do is we run all of these experiments. And what we're doing right now, let's use the argument of same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage is an experiment. The pill is an experiment we're running all of these experiments, and the question is, well, we've got thousands of years doing it this way. Now we've got 5 years of doing it this way. Should we come to a decision? How do we make a decision? How do we study it? Well, these are really big questions. So Dillahunty says, well, read the Humanist Manifesto. So I did. I went and I found them. And these are very recent. Now you might say 1933. Peterson keeps saying, you can't construct an ethics based on what's 500 years old. And he's speaking about the Enlightenment. And that's in a sense what the modernists are doing. He's saying we have thousands of years of evidence. Why would you just stick it on 500? Well, the Humanist Manifesto is 1933. We don't even have 100 years on that sucker. This is very recent. And one of the things I often tell people is that religion is, in a sense, a Ulysses trial. What's a Ulysses trial? Ulysses or Odysseus wanted to know if he could withstand the harpies. So what did he do? He had all of his sailors put wax in their ears. He was an elitist. He didn't trust them, but he was also enough of a religionist to say, and tie me to the mast and don't believe anything I say while I'm under the influence of the harpies. So he's tied to the mast and they pass by the harpies and the harpies sing their song, and he would have directed his ships to be cast into the rocks, but all of the sailors were told, use your eyes, not your ears. In a sense, part of what religion is a Ulysses contract, where we strap ourselves to the wisdom of our ancestors and we say, a lot of stuff is going to be flying at us. Do I really trust myself in the moment? Think about thinking fast and slow. Slow thinking is usually better thinking. Well, part of the spirit of the age says, all those old dead people, all those old dead white men that left us their books. We now know how to chart our course into the future. Okay, go for it. You might become like a bottle beetle, sitting there humping that beer bottle, and your whole species goes extinct because your idea is only this old, even though you had this much information. How often does it get updated? So I did, this is how a Humanist Manifesto, Matt Dillahunty. I did the Google search and it's like, okay, well, what can I find? First thing that came up, which was really interesting, was a reference to Dillahunty and Peterson. I thought, well, this is interesting. In this video, Matt was mad about the 32-minute mark because Peterson said that the secular humanism was tried by the communists and failed. Then Matt said, there's something about Soviet Russia that could be, there was nothing about Soviet Russia that could be considered secular humanist, and that Jordan should read the secular humanist manifestos. Oh, well, the original secular humanist manifesto of 1933, here it is. Oh, I just read through the items on the list. It's almost like a blueprint for communism. Well, this is Reddit. They're not going to let that stand. How is the Soviet Union close to, we assert that secular humanists affirm life rather than deny it? Isn't the opposite of the Soviet Union. But now pay attention, and this is where we get back into some of the earlier conversations. Whose life? You know, even in the supposed egalitarian culture wars we have now, we are always privileging some voices over another. That is basically the definition of argument. And you know, so we must win the election for our tribe. Our judges should be on the Supreme Court. Our ideas should reign. Because why? Because for the sake of life, we don't want to be that beetle humping away on that bottle, bringing the species to extinction. So the guy jumps back in again. Read 14th. Humanists are firmly convinced that existing acquisitive and profit-motivated society has shown itself to be inadequate and that a radical change in methods, controls, and motives must be institutionalized. A socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end that the equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. The goal of humanism is a free and universal society in which people voluntarily and intelligently cooperate for the common good. Humanists demand a shared life in a shared world. 1933. When was that? It's in the Depression. What's going on in American history in the 20s? A lot of Americans are really excited about the new Bolshevik model, and there's a lot of propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union talking about how great everything is going. Now let's hide the fact that we're starving Ukraine and Belarus to death, and basically read Bloodlands from Timothy Snyder. Don't read it if you're prone to depression, because if you read that book, yeah, it's a brutal book. What's happening in 1933? Well, it's the New Deal. Pessimism about markets. Why pessimism about markets? Because markets failed us in the 20s with the Great Crash. What we need is centralized planning. Well, centralized planning in the Soviet Union, centralized planning in the United States. All the intellectuals excited about the new Soviet way. This was the mood of the day. Let's talk about human agency. We are, especially in our culture, in American culture, so wrapped up in the bubble we are living in. And in this present moment, I will wonderfully declare what is truth. Well, what did Ulysses do? He strapped himself to the mast. Why? He at least knew enough about the decisions he makes in the moment. What does that tell us about us? What does that tell us about how we should regard the past? Now, basically, we should regard the past. We should give our ancestors a seat at the table. We should listen to them. We're always going to decide. That's what agency means. But 1933, this looks self-evident. To be fair, that point was dropped in latter editions. Oh, really? Well, what points in the 1993 edition will be dropped in the 2033 edition? Fair enough, I don't really know much about it. None of us know much about it. That's part of the problem. We don't know a lot about a lot. We're not that smart. I was replying to Legends about the edition that was linked. Anyway, you get my point. This gets into Jordan Peterson's idea of truth. It's truth that keeps you alive. Now, this is where, in a sense, Hoffman and Peterson might have an argument about what do we mean by truth, because Hoffman is using a referential definition of truth. Hoffman and Darwin say fitness beats truth. Peterson changes the definition of truth and says, in a sense, fitness is truth. Well, that's interesting. This is all going to get interesting. Peterson redefines truth by incorporating Darwin, and that's why Peterson would say, Dillahunty is a Newtonian. I am a Darwinist, says Peterson. Referential schemes relying on the ability to evaluate, but where do we find that capacity? Well, again, there's nothing like a YouTube channel to bring me good resources. Somebody following me picked this up with an interesting conversation between Dillahunty and a Christian evangelist, Slick.
So, like I said, there's no guarantee that any particular brain is going to actually reason correctly.
There's no guarantee that any particular brain is actually going to reason correctly. True. So then, how do we get to reason or truth?
And what I will say is that logic is not something that is, or the foundations of thought aren't something that are produced by a brain. They are truths that we recognize.
Got a lot of interesting discussion on the question about laws. They are truths that we recognize. If our brains aren't competent to recognize truth, how can we recognize these truths? Where do they come from? Again, laws. Laws are things that we've seen repeated. We've seen them repeated enough so that we say they're good enough. We're talking probability now. We're not talking certainty, probability. These measurements are good enough. When you go to Rupert Sheldrake talking about differences in big G, gravity, talking about differences in the speed of light. Look at the Russell Brand, Rupert Sheldrake conversation, or Rupert Sheldrake's TED Talk, where he talks about some of these things. And again, Sheldrake's, I'm not buying the whole package there. I'm just saying, if the constants move, constants aren't quite what we're saying constants are. Now, maybe they're constant enough for our systems to work, but now we're over into pragmatism. Now we're over into this. And so, but you can't have it both ways. You can't say our brains, because they are just the sum part, like the lawnmower, of all these natural processes, can't really know truth, but we recognize these truths. Well, please tell me, what is recognizing those truths? Because if it's not us, who is it? Well, if you go back to Newton or Descartes, they would say God is giving laws. God gave laws for behavior. God gave laws for nature. Nature follows God's law. That's why we call them laws. We follow God's law, but we're not quite as obedient as nature. Now, what happens with deism is we keep the language of laws and nature, and in deism we keep the God, and we keep the God ensuring that everything is working right, because God does not change. You take another step, again, read Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. We decide we don't need the God anymore, we just have the laws. Well, why do we keep calling them laws? Because we can't think of a better word. But do we mean laws? We should probably think of a better word. Maybe we'll call them constants. But are these constants always true? And then Einstein comes around and says, well, in terms of time space, they're mostly true. Newton didn't quite have it right. Okay, so we keep changing the laws. Well, whose laws are they? Are they God's laws anymore? No, they're our laws. We're making the laws. But didn't we just say our capacity to do this is built on us and we're unreliable? Oh, but certain really smart people are more reliable. Oh, but we didn't like that elitism, but we kind of keep having to defer to it because it is authority. Well, let's let these two talk a little bit more.
They are the truths demonstrated by a simple Venn diagram that something is either A or not A.
Demonstrated to whom? Evaluated by whom?
That's it.
You're not answering the question.
Okay, the question is, how can a brain produce logic?
How does a brain restricted to physical laws of chemistry and physics? I'm just going to use motion, matter, chemistry, physics. How does that produce proper logical inference? As you said, which I think is very interesting, is not dependent upon the human brain. I totally agree with you. Well, then that means your brain, my brain are different brains. We can't use your brain or my brain to be the standards of logical inference.
Can we use them to be the standards of what we call physical laws?
We can't. We both agree. We both make mistakes. We're both not perfect in our logical thinking.
What do we point to?
We apply to something else these laws of logic. Now, the issue is...
Correct.
And where we point to something else. How do we deal with them? Well, now a pragmatist might say they're good enough.
Physical brain, yeah, and they're outside of ourselves.
Correct.
The physical, oh, there you go.
Except they don't exist as
yes,
things.
yes. He's moving towards my
they
side,
are not
theism.
contingent upon any individual's thought. They don't exist as a thing.
So my question...
They don't exist as a thing. Well, what are they? Are they material? Do they come as a result of the material world? What are they? You can't tell me what they are. And again, there's back into the question of math. Do we create math or do we discover math? If humans were to disappear, would math disappear? Well, what are these things?
The question is, how does the physical brain, where one chemical state relates to another chemical state or changes to one, how does it produce proper logical inference? Does it?
Can it?
Can it?
Yes, otherwise we wouldn't.
How would you know?
Because we can recognize it through the logic that we just talked about. So,
Wait
Who recognizes it?
a minute. If your brain's saying that, and that's all that is of physical chemicals, you can't say that to be true. Because you don't know if your brain's saying that is right. You're just...
And if you want to see this, teach math to grade schoolers. And you get a sense of what our brains are. And you say, oh no, we teach math so that they learn. Okay, what are we building up? But what is this whole system? What is this whole system dependent upon? And again, you can watch that video if you like to too. Well, it's the sovereign self. Well, where does this sovereign self live? Now, Dillahunty wants to say, well, no, we know what right and wrong is. We've got that straight. And so all we have to do is keep maintaining that by teaching it to our children. And then when we update it, we will. And we're not exactly sure who's going to update it. Now, if we were having this conversation in the 1950s, the landscape would be very different because we'd still be fighting Russia. People would be a lot scarier about atheists because we as a nation mobilized ourselves around religiosity. Church attendance reached its height during the Cold War, okay? Because we put one nation under God on our currency, on our coins during the Cold War. We put one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance during the Cold War. Why? We were motivated. So it's interesting how, I'm not going to say a humanist, but an atheistic regime made America the most religious it's ever been. Okay. Now come the 1980s. We flip-flop on it. Now the big bad adversary we're afraid of are the people that took down the World Trade Center and landed a plane into the Pentagon. Now suddenly religion is suspect. So we flip it all around. The nuns rise. People stop going to church. Well, you've got a pretty good argument for human flakiness and our inability to know the truth and our adaptability to determine ourselves with respect to fitness. Because the entire country is just trying to figure out, what do I need to do to fit in? And why does sociology of knowledge work? Why did, for example, in the 1950s, so many things in the last 10 years have just kind of flipped around in terms of, well, it's obvious that what? It's obvious that a boy can have a girl's brain. Okay. It's obvious that two women who love each other should be given a marriage license. It's not obvious. There was a case in England where two sisters figured out that financially they would do better if they would be wife and wife rather than sisters. They applied to marry in England and they were shot down. Why? Because what? Fitness. We're always adapting. We're always taking shortcuts to try to figure this out. Well, what does this undermine? This undermines this hallowed sense of reason that is supposed to be our guide going forward. And so what we have is the sovereign self. Now, Sam Harris, that 10 years ago would have been imagined on the left. Now the left has moved to a degree so that Sam Harris is debating the guy from Vox. And why? Because now Sam Harris is what? He's a fascist. I heard his conversation with Timothy Snyder. Sam Harris is no fascist. Sam Harris is like Jordan Peterson, someone on the moderate left. Well, what's been happening? Well, we thought that now that, okay, we're not fearing the Soviet Union, we're not going to be all about God, because that's going to keep us safe in the Cold War. Now we're going to be all against God because of those nasty Muslims over there. And so where can we find truth? We find it from the inside. And so the atheists that were hoping that their day would come, now that Islam is the bad guy, suddenly realize that human beings are not being rational at all now, and now it's the sovereign self. It's the God within. It's eat, pray, love. I've done a lot of blogging on David Brooks, the path to character, the road to character. It's the new self from inside, and now you've got Sam Harris with his intellectual dark web aligned with Jordan Peterson. I haven't heard Dillahunty. He's probably on their side. They're all aligned along with an obviously religious person like Ben Shapiro against all of the touchy-feely people who are finding themselves, and they're sometimes spiritual. You see, the identity of the individual self is necessarily in relationship to a far bigger story, which has been the point Peterson has been making all along. It was the insight that Jung had. Jung is teaching is starting in his first job in a mental hospital, and all the other doctors say, don't bother talking to the crazy people because they're crazy. And he's like, Wait a minute, I thought that's why we're here, to try and help them. Nah, we can't help these people. They're all nuts. So Jung listens to them, and he hears them, and he begins to say, their craziness has a pattern. And their craziness is connected to archetypes and things out there in the world and big stories. These people aren't just rational or irrational. It's all bound together. And well, what's happening now? Tim Keller has a wonderful example of this with a thought experiment of a young New Yorker. And, well, Tim Keller, obviously a religious man. What now does Dillahunty face? Let's go back a little bit.
And then do all we can to realize them, regardless of constraint or opposition. Sociologist Robert Bellah has called this narrative expressive individual gospel at the points where these basic...
Okay, basically, now that we seem to be getting rid of religion, so the nuns, N-O-N-E-S's, are on the rise. Are people getting more rational? You just remove religion. Do they get more rational? It doesn't look that way.
Baseline cultural narratives. Integrity, humility, and love require us to sincerely and appreciatively affirm much of what they contain, since we see their clear origins in Christianity. Yet, we must show their dangers and flaws, how they absolutize and essentially deify many good things in the absence of faith in the author of all things. And we must offer the benefits of the gospel at the points where these narratives fail to deliver.
Okay, here we start the section.
Engaging the identity narrative, the sovereign self. Many argue that the most fundamental of the late modern narratives is that of identity, that we must discover our deepest desires and longings and then do all we can to realize them, regardless of constraint or opposition.
Now, we thought it was going to be reason. No.
Constraint or opposition. Sociologist Robert Bellah has called this narrative expressive individualism. I will call it the sovereign self. We should start by recognizing the great good ushered in by the modern emphasis on the individual. In the past, vast numbers of people were locked into a given social status in rigidly hierarchical societies where people had to remain forever on the lower rungs of the social ladder simply because that was seen to be their duty and their place. My grandfather was born in Italy in 1880. He was told that his only options were to become a priest, go into the military, or pursue the family trade. He did not want to give his life to any of those. In response, he emigrated to the United States, coming through Ellis Island into a more individualistic society where he could shape a life that fit his personal aspirations. Christianity has always seen the importance of the heart and its loves. Augustine's Confessions represented an innovation in the history of human thought, a thoroughgoing examination of inner motivations and desires. Unlike the thinkers of classical antiquity, Christians regarded emotions as something not to be ignored or simply suppressed, but instead to be examined and redirected toward God. Much of the modern understanding of the feelings and the self has grown from these Christian roots. The new late modern narrative, however, goes beyond merely understanding and directing our own passions to enthroning them. Its essence is captured by the words of the song Let It Go in the Disney movie Frozen. The song is sung by a character determined no longer to be the good girl that her family and society had wanted her to be.
So children are going to pick this up from their parents. Well, what's the narrative they're picking up from their parents? Frozen.
To be. Instead, she would let go and express what she had been holding back inside. There is no right or wrong, no rules for her. This is a good example of the expressive individualism Bellah described. Identity is not realized, as in traditional societies, by sublimating our individual desires for the good of our family and people. Instead, we become ourselves only by asserting our individual desires against society, by expressing our feelings and fulfilling our dreams, regardless of what anyone says. There are many severe problems with the sovereign self as a philosophy of life. To begin with, it assumes that we know what we want. that our inner desires are coherent and harmonious. Modernity tells you to discover your deepest desires and fulfill them, but our deepest desires often contradict one another. A desire for a stellar career will often be in conflict with the desire for a particular relationship, and our feelings constantly shift. So, an identity based on our feelings will be unstable and incoherent. An even more serious problem is that an identity based on expressing ourselves without listening to outside dictates is actually an illusion. A popular exponent of the sovereign self was Gail Sheehy in books like the seminal Passages in 1976. She insists that you can become yourself only when you can look inside and express yourself apart from any external valuations and accreditations. This is patently impossible. Imagine an Anglo-Saxon warrior in Britain in AD 800. He has two very strong inner impulses and feelings. One is aggression. He loves to smash and kill people when they show him disrespect. Living in a shame and honor culture with its warrior ethic, he will identify with that feeling. He will say to himself, "That's me. That's who I am. I will express that." The other feeling he senses is same-sex attraction. To that he will say, "That's not me. I will control and suppress that impulse." Now imagine a young man walking around Manhattan today. He has the same two inward impulses, both equally strong, both difficult to control. What will he say? He will look at the aggression and think, "This is not who I want to be," and will seek deliverance in therapy and anger management programs. He will look at his sexual desire, however, and conclude, "That is who I am." What does this thought experiment show us? Primarily, it reveals that we do not get our identity simply from within. Rather, we receive some interpretive moral grid, lay it down over our various feelings and impulses, and sift them through it. This grid helps us decide which feelings are me and should be expressed, and which are not and should not be. So this grid of interpretive beliefs, not an innate, unadulterated expression of our feelings, is what shapes our identity.
So, what's it going to be? Reason or feelings? And both of them are connected to what's outside. Who decides the interpretive grid? Now we're back to the question of authority. Atheist societies tend to devolve into tyranny. Why? Because there's no higher authority over man. Some man must be in charge because there is no God. Now, one nation under God. This is what always surprises me about these conversations, that when we're talking about an atheist society, our minds always turn to, let's say, Russia. Well, this is kind of funny. American society was designed to be secular. Now I've probably ticked off a whole bunch of atheists. Now I'm going to tick off a whole bunch of Christians, because when we put in one nation under God, we indulged ourselves in a story of Christian past. Well, the founding of the United States is a lot more complicated than that. The New Englanders were attempting to found some sort of utopian religious society. Calvinists, Puritans, Christians, and they got slightly tyrannical in some ways that would make all of us feel uncomfortable. If you lived there, you had to go to church. There is a relationship often between utopianism and tyranny, whether it's religious or secular. Well, I don't know why the atheists, when they're looking around for a humanist, secular humanist society, don't pick ours. Because in some ways, ours is. What we do, in a sense, the word God does not show up in the American Constitution. We divinize a document and sacrilize a process. And this is why there's a lot of conversation about, is Donald Trump breaking democracy? Well, you know, if 4 years comes by and he is not reelected into office and he stays in office, I will say, yep, it's busted, because every time an American president leaves the White House, This practice is reaffirming a long-standing practice. Why? Because the process is sacred. And what that goes to show is that you have to have something sacred. Okay? There must be sacred. And I believe it's earlier in this conversation where Dillahunty, maybe it's later in this conversation, where he says there's nothing sacred. No, that's not going to work. There has to be something sacred. People need to be under something. And this is why you have the law. And even in the Old Testament context, you have the covenant. And you get into the New Testament context, this gets a little, well, are they under the apostles? Is it the apostles? And this then, of course, drives us into the Protestant Reformation, or are they under Scripture? So something needs to be sacred. Now, part of the reason why I think atheists don't point to America as their secular humanist society, which I think is arguably one of the best secular humanist societies we've seen, is because almost all the founding fathers were either Christians or deists. Now, deists are a half-step basically outside of Christianity. There still is a God, they're still theists, but that God is not involved. He simply set up the universe and decreed laws of nature, and his unchangeability makes sure that the laws are not changed. So deism, which is a devolved Christianity, and Christianity dominated the social scene at the founding of the United States. Lots of arguments that this only works, however, when people are religious. And you can find, Prager, for example, that whole community will argue that line, that in order for a sacralized system to remain in place, the people underneath must have religion in order to be moral. Now, of course, the atheists come along and they say, no, that's garbage. The people should give up their religion and they can still be moral. But I think if you're looking for social experiments, at the end of the Cold War, when religion has been steadily being given up, the atheists might see some little bump, but where do the lion's share of people go to? Well, right now in American culture, they have tended to go to either usually a combination of some non-formal spirituality that tends to have the sacred self. Then Tim Keller comes along and says, yeah, but you know what? That sacred self still is defined by a contemporary interpretive structure. And the young man who, in a past society, this is what Peterson says in his thing, in a past society, it was popular to be a warrior where you go out and express what is now termed toxic masculinity. Well, now the interpretive frameworks, but maybe you had same-sex attraction. Now you say, oh, your same-sex attraction is going to be celebrated, but your toxic masculinity must not be suppressed. Well, what's the difference between the two? Is it reason? Or is it the dominating story in the culture? There's no escaping any of this, boys and girls. How to make people moral? Well, raise them in it. You have to. There's no other way. But what of it is built in from the ground floor? Well, that's where you're going to get Peterson and Jonathan Haidt piping in. When they grow up, they will think for themselves. No, they won't. They will think according to the interpretive framework that is probably whatever is in some ascendant, attractive group. They will want to be like some celebrity they see or something that's exalted by their community. That's sociology of knowledge. Dillahunty wants to keep saying that the advantage of irreligion is that it is updatable. Well, yeah, you've had to update the Human Manifesto, and it's only been around since 1933, and I believe we're on revision 3, and the reason Dillahunty could chastise Jordan Peterson for not reading it is he probably didn't. Well, why didn't he? Because there's no reason for him to read it. Well, all those people out there with sovereign selves, are they reading it? Nope. What are they reading? They're reading People magazine. They're looking for spirituality in all kinds of different ways. They're finding the low-hanging fruit. You now have the problem of how updatable and by whom. Well, now we get into the authority. Well, how did it work in the Soviet Union? How does it work in many cultures? Well, somebody has to be the authority. Well, what's the way to make that authority most enduring? Well, make them a god. This is old. Read history. Read classical history. Read ancient history. None of this is new. Well, what about Christianity? Well, a while ago I preached a sermon on sola scriptura. And what I would say, people might ask the question, well, why? How on earth is Christianity still kicking around? I thought this was all going to go away after the end of the First World War. Why does it endure? Well, Jordan Peterson, even with his agnostic stance, would say, well, because it works. Well, why does it work? Well, it works because of the Bible. Well, why does Jordan Peterson read the Bible? Well, see, there is a narrative thread that gives shape to progress. And there is always change. And so what's going on right now in Christianity? Well, there are some big conversations going on in Christianity. Does the ordination of women change the dynamics sufficiently as to deconstruct and destroy the narrative thread? What about same-sex attraction? These are current things that are being worked out in Christian history. Well, if you read church history, what you see are a succession of trial experiments. And if you read, for example, Alistair McGrath's book on heresy, which I've mentioned in previous videos, what McGrath basically says is that what happens in church history is that all these new ideas come up. And there's, in a sense, a Darwinist process at work with these new ideas and theologies. And what we tend to find is that ideas which break the narrative thread wind up being religiously evolutionary dead ends. And these experiments run for hundreds of years. Well, why are the vast majority of the world's Christians Trinitarian when Trinitarianism is a really hard thing to think about? Oh, because Arianism was a dead end. Do we know why Arianism was a dead end? Probably not very clearly. Do the vast majority of billions of Christians know anything about Trinitarianism and Arianism? Not a lot. But deep inside, these things were a dead end, and somehow we're smarter than our conscious minds are, and over long periods of time, these things get worked out. Well, why in the 20th century did we have the good fortune not to have the world slip into fascism or slip into communism? Well, we figured some things out, and we know communism is not the way to go. So you can have Sam Harris, who believes that, well, we can get rid of all this archaic Christian stuff and just take the cream off the ethical top and say, well, this is what we know, and now we're going to add some meditation and some other things in there. Okay, but are you sure you can get rid of that foundation? Because probably what's been holding it together is this narrative thread. And what drew my attention to Jordan Peterson was he's on the other side of modernity. And he wants to read the Bible and study it for his own reasons. A lot of people thought modernity was going to be the end of Christianity. Who would have thought a PhD in psychology in the University of Toronto would be selling out theaters, talking, thinking out loud, trying to figure out the Bible, and have how many thousands of people interested in what he has to say? Jesus says about God's Word, which would have been understood as the Old Testament to Jesus' listeners and gets reinterpreted in the New Testament to include the New Testament, that God's Word will not pass away. Well, what's really funny is it hasn't passed away yet. And Jordan Peterson's argument is basically, all these little tricks and proposals that we have, they're not going to work. And so when he looks at Dillahunty, he says, it's not going to work. And I'd say people have been trying Dillahunty for 100 years, and it hasn't been working. And they might say, yeah, Christianity looks like it's on the ropes too. And I'd say, yeah, but doggone it, that fighter has been in a long time, as have the other religions. We don't have temples, a lot of temples to Marduk anymore. So what happens with the Bible is that there's a narrative thread. There's always change, but somehow the Bible has within itself ways to keep basically the weeds under control. I mentioned Paul's letter to Timothy. Paul says to Timothy, treat the older women in the church like mothers and the younger women in the church like sisters, because Timothy's a young man. Well, why is that important? Well, this Paul gets from, the religion he grew up with, and it's in Scripture, and there are rules about sexual behavior, and those rules have been tried for thousands of years, and they've not only been tried within Christianity, they've been tried outside of Christianity. Now, I don't want this to devolve, into a conversation about sex, but what we have in the contemporary era is we have all of these experiments going on at once, and the more experiments we put up into the air, all the watchers in our head get increasingly nervous. And what do they tend to default to? What we've known before. And this is, in a sense, why the more chaos you put into the system, the more order people want to impose. Now we're back into Peterson's order chaos thing. Well, where's the Bible in this? The Bible always contains progress. And as I said in, I think it was the first part of this, you wouldn't have same-sex marriage if it wouldn't be for Christianity. Now, the left in the church currently celebrates this, and the right in the church currently denounces this. But this is part of the ongoing theological experiment that Christianity has been conducting for the last 2,000 years. And we've been conducting it in many, 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 many trials. And if one side basically says, we don't care about the Bible, what happens to that side is they usually just kind of wander off into nothing. And you can, in fact, even see that in churches. Why is the Bible so enduring within certain churches? It's enduring in the Orthodox Church. It's enduring in the Roman Catholic Church. It's enduring in segments of the Protestant Church. They're not willing to give it up. Well, the Bible is a very, very old experiment that we've been running. And if you've got to put money on something, it's good to bet on the Bible, because that old book has endured, and it's endured a lot. And I'm not saying that, well, it's because everybody got their interpretations right. No, it's because everybody got their interpretations wrong, but the interpretations that were really wrong fell off the table. And so this jumble of interpretations has existed and gone with us through history, and so that's why we still use it. Now the atheist will say, ha, they're with Steve Jobs and saying, reject the dogmas, think for yourself. History might say, that's evolutionarily a bad idea. You should probably think with your ancestors. Don't be a slave to them, but you'd better listen to them, because you've got a lot to learn from them. Because also when it comes to ideologies, Peterson says, what is an ideology? It's a crippled religion. Well, why? Well, if you read the Bible, there's all these polarities in it. And what those polarities do is keep tension within different things that are probably, and I think Peterson is right, probably built into us. And the Bible keeps those tensions. What is an ideology? Well, you lose half of it and you fly off. Well, and what do you fly off into? Well, you fly off into your own destruction. The long evolved natural tensions are removed and the system runs amok. Well, what does this mean? In a sense, what we're saying when we say, we now in this generation know more than everybody else, it's like giving children the keys to the car and saying, have a good time. Well, I'll tell you, give them enough chance to drive and they'll probably crack it up. Religions have deeply embedded wisdom. One generation is insufficient to evaluate because societies are multi-generational. Matt Dillahunty says, go ahead and deconvert. What's the use? It hasn't hurt me. Well, but go back to session 1. My great-great-grandfather deconverted and sent my family on a path. I think it's been a good path. All of the relatives that were left in England that had nothing to, well, they stayed in their Jewish community. They were all killed by the Holocaust. It's only Hartog's family that survived because they went to the U.S. And this was, 50 years before the rise of Hitler. He couldn't have known that. And it wasn't a choice that he could rationally make. One generation is insufficient to evaluate because societies are multi-generational. We need long-term experiments. And in fact, we're always undergoing them. Those findings are built into religions. The religions that endure probably have something to be said for them, because there's a lot more religions that haven't endured. And contra to what Dillahunty says, religions are always changing, but they're always changing and not changing. Because what you see in church history is that people will try something out and they'll come back. They'll try something out and they'll come back. That's the way it is. They are the oldest systems we have, and we need them most now with technological disruption. In this course that I've been listening to on the history of science in the 20th century, part of the Great Courses series, one of the points that the author of this makes is that in the last 300 years, most of the disruptions that we've seen in cultures in the West have come through technology. Yeah, that's a big deal. We don't know where this is going. Well, technological disruption. What tends to balance technological disruption? Well, listen to Dillahunty, and a lot of the atheists will say, we need religions to stop hindering technological progression. What, if you listen to Richard Dawkins, what Christians is he most annoyed at? Well, they're the ones saying we shouldn't teach evolution. Now, this isn't to get into that debate, but here's the thing. The evolution that the Scopes trial was about with William Jennings Bryan was an evolution that had built into it racial superiority. Today we look at that and say, oh yeah, that evolution that had built into it racial superiority, we reject that. You didn't reject that in 1933. That didn't get rejected until Hitler brought it fully into bloom, and afterwards everyone says, oh, that was a bad idea. Let's not connect skin color with being close to apes. That's a bad idea, and it's also not true. But read the history of evolution. So you might say, yeah, but we know better now. Okay, 100 years from now, what things do we have now that they will critique? 100 years ago, we are critiquing a lot of things that they had 100 years ago. The experiments we're running, and we're running so many of them, we don't know where they're going. And to simply say, now we know, is an evolutionary bad bet. And this is, in a sense, why Dillahunty and Peterson differ. And I've never said Jordan Peterson is the new C.S. Lewis. But what he and C.S. Lewis have in common is that C.S. Lewis was deeply skeptical about new things being embraced for their newness. Jordan Peterson is too, but in different ways, because he says, well, evolutionarily, and he has rejiggered his definition of truth. And this is all a very interesting conversation, and this has gone on to be very, very long. Maybe this is my worst video, and at this point I'm thinking in my mind, should I post this one or not? But doggone it, I've invested so much time in it. And this morning when I laid it all out, it seemed like a good idea, but here it is. And so to not post it is to waste it, so I'm going to post it. But question number 2, maybe we should just go back and, now let's not go back because that would take too much time. Well, what was the question? Well, Mr. Dillahunty, this morality stuff, are you really sure that giving up God is, we can just kind of give him up and things will be okay? Sure, it'll be okay. He's hardly operating to begin with. Peterson says, I think that's a really bad idea. And there's the difference between the two of them.